Muhammad ibn Abi Amir returned to Cordoba triumphantly. He took the new title, which would be remembered by history, Al-Mansour, which meant the victorious. Al-Mansour was one of the smoothest operators in history. He had succeeded in a coup right under everybody's nose. He would be the de facto ruler of Al-Andalus for the next 20 years. The man went to work right away, consolidating his power. He even built himself a new palace called Al-Madina al-Zahira, not to be confused with Rahman's pleasure palace of Madinat al-Zahara, and he proceeded to transfer all the administrational offices and command facilities to this new location so he could isolate his power. For all of those years, he kept Hisham II nicely locked away inside his gilded golden cage, surrounded by a life of mindless indulgence in Cordoba. Al-Mansour began to shift the focus to a military basis. The army was expanded and more Berber and Saqaliba troops were brought in from North Africa and Eastern Europe respectively. The cost of maintaining the army was enormous and came at the expense of patronage to the arts and sciences, but it was under Al-Mansour's reign that Al-Andalus would reach its zenith, militarily if nothing else. Multiple campaigns were thus launched against the Christian kingdoms in the north. It was estimated to be about 50 in all. And it was even recorded that at one point there were so many Christian slaves being brought in from these expeditions that it dropped their market price. Some military missions were particularly vicious, like the assault on Barcelona, which was attacked in 985, and Santiago de Compostela, which was razed to the ground in 987. But was having a massive army and attacking everybody in sight truly the best use of a state? Kennedy comments on this, quote, Al-Mansour had significantly undermined the prestige of the Umayyad dynasty, which had been the focus of unity in Muslim Spain for so long. He had systematically destroyed the authority of anybody who could command a following in the state, and his subordinates were often people of little independent standing. While he remained in charge, the system worked, despite the cruelty it exhibited at the highest level. Under less competent management, its future was less assured. End quote. Al-Mansour, our de facto ruler, became sick and died in the year 1002. His son, Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar, inherited a powerful state with a vast army. But he didn't have the cunning of his father. Abd al-Malik didn't have the discipline and the patience to rule the more domestic side of his government, and instead would focus on any attempt he could find on escapism. This would usually come in the form of wine and other earthly pleasures. But his favorite pastime by far was attacking the north, again and again and again, and this wasn't meant to gain land, but rather to simply raid Christian territories. However, what he failed to notice was that the Christian kingdoms in the north were beginning to hold their own militarily, and the raids were getting less and less successful. Kennedy comments, quote, Al-Muzaffar's way of dealing with and perhaps escaping from these problems was to devote himself to the Holy War, and he launched annual raids against the Christians. Here again, the Arab chroniclers portray this as a stream of victories, but in truth, the results were pretty meager and amounted to the sacking of a few frontier forts. An ominous sign for the future was that Christian resistance to these campaigns was fierce, and Count Sancho Garcia of Castile especially showed himself to be an opponent who could take on the Muslims on equal terms. End quote. The Christian kingdoms were small in comparison to Al-Andalus at this point in history, but as Mark Twain said, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And Al-Andalus was beginning to lose its edge. As can be expected, our boy didn't last very long. He ruled Al-Andalus for about 6 years, and then had himself a, quote, premature death. He was succeeded in 1008 by his half-brother, who was ironically named Abd al-Rahman, but was known to history as Sanchuelo, or Little Sancho. He was, after all, named after his maternal grandfather, who was from Navarre. This guy was a total idiot. The year that he came to power, he made Caliph Hisham II sign paperwork that made himself the next heir to the Caliphate, rather than just a high-level bureaucrat that his brother and father pretended to be. This was an insult to everyone, but ironically, he was the only person who didn't understand what a mistake he had just made. Little Sancho liked to fight like his sibling, and oblivious to the trouble that he had just created for himself, he immediately went off to the north to fight the Christians. Not surprisingly, as soon as everybody found out that he was gone, Al-Andalus erupted into civil war. An Umayyad coup attempted to put Hisham back on the throne. The remaining members of the Umayyad family descended on Cordoba. They captured the city and then proceeded to raise an army of the locals, who were unfortunately mainly artisans and merchants. When Sanchuelo heard of this uprising, he turned his forces around, but he was abandoned by his own troops, who also thought he was an idiot for losing his capital. In a vain attempt to get back to his seat of power, he was captured near Cordoba and executed. But now things went from bad to worse. The Berbers and the Saqaliba, who Al-Mansour and his Amorid lineage had brought in to defend Al-Andalus, and who were now whipped into a new state of readiness from Al-Mansour's aggressive foreign policy, were now leaderless, and they were hated by the Arabs and the Umayyad, who wanted to reduce them to the status of second-class citizens. But these same Berbers and Saqaliba were also skilled warriors, and when pushed too far, they resorted to what they did best: pillage and slaughter. The Berbers would eventually join up with the people of Castile, who were eager for revenge, and together they attacked Cordoba in 1009, which was only defended by makeshift last-second militia. The city was taken and sacked. The people inside were massacred. But Cordoba's pain was to continue. She was again to be put to siege in the year 1013, and again the results would be dreadful for its inhabitants. With the fall of Cordoba, Al-Andalus would descend into anarchy. Michael Berry, in his book, Homage to Al-Andalus, summarizes it well. Quote, "And thus in scarcely more than 20 years fell the great Caliphate of Cordoba. It had been one of the richest and most prosperous states of medieval Europe. It had been well administered with many talented figures. It had reduced the Christian states to the north to the condition of being mere vassals. The Fatimid threat had receded in North Africa, and Al-Andalus had a strategic grip on that territory. It had grand cities, great scholars, being probably amongst the most cultured places in Europe at the time. So why did it fall? The immediate blame can be attributed to the fallibility of the incompetent Sanchuelo and the useless Hisham II. But the underlying causes were many: the resentment of the Arab aristocracy at losing its influence, the slaves who lost power and dispersed to the regions, the large number of Berbers inscribed in the army. All these centrifugal forces grew, and the great Andalusi state flew apart and fragmented into a myriad of small states, known as the taifas." End quote. Abd al-Rahman III brought his nation from the brink of annihilation to become a pillar of civilization. He restored his economy, his military, and most of all his prestige, all the while establishing a caliphate and making Al-Andalus a cultural epicenter equivalent to Baghdad or Constantinople. He created a palace that was the envy of medieval Europe and held supremacy over his Christian neighbors in the north and Fatimid opponents in the south. Yet within 50 years of his death, it was all gone. Cordoba was a shadow of our former self. Madinat al-Zahra was in ruins, and the caliphate was to be abolished in the year 1031, never to rise again. I asked at the beginning of this podcast what makes a great leader. Is it the monuments they leave, the battles they've won, the decrees they've enacted, or the social impact that they leave behind? Perhaps a great leader's legacy is all of this, but perhaps it could also be something more. You see, Abd al-Rahman III had a daily journal, and despite his 49 years of rule, nearly half a century, he mentions in his memoirs that during all this time, he had only 14 days of true unbridled happiness. I wonder what those days were. Was it when he became caliph? Or when he destroyed the line of Umar ibn Hafsun? Or perhaps when he saw his firstborn son? Rahman does not specify. But I do think he became more retrospective towards the end, and in one of his final entries, he told the world one great statement that I think adds to his lasting legacy. Like many philosopher kings in history, Gilgamesh, Nebuchadnezzar, Solomon, Marcus Aurelius, the mighty Caliph of Cordoba conquered all the world had to offer, and in his dying days he came to the same epiphany that in order to be a great leader, a little humility goes a long way. Quote, I have now reigned above 50 years in victory or peace, beloved by my subjects, dreaded by my enemies, and respected by my allies. Riches and honors, power and pleasure have waited on my call, nor does any earthly blessing appear to be wanting to my felicity. In this situation, I have diligently numbered the days of pure and genuine happiness which have fallen to my lot. They amount to 14. O mortal man, place not thy confidence in this present world. End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, this ends episode 5. Join us next time in the continuing story of Al-Andalus when I talk about the culture of Cordoba, a city that a chronicler regarded as a, quote, ornament of the world. Folks, in doing the research on this podcast, I found that there is a complete and total lack of awareness of Abd al-Rahman III, at least compared to his contemporaries. I find this personally sad and disheartening, and I ask you to spread word about the podcast, if nothing else, at least about this particular episode. For someone who did what he did, and the lessons on leadership that he left behind, well, I think it should be better acknowledged, at least in my humble opinion. By the way, if you like the music, it's from Karunesh and Paul Avgerinos, both of whom have graciously given me permission to air their music on the podcast. The other files come from Round Sky Music, YouTube Archives, and Purple Planet Music. The links will be in the description of the podcast below. I want to thank both Karunesh and Paul Avgerinos again. They have my deepest gratitude for allowing me to air their music. Now looking back, it has taken me a month to create this podcast. If you liked it, please take 1 minute to rate and review on iTunes/Apple Podcasts. I would really appreciate that. If you like what you are listening to, also consider contributing to Flashpoint History on Patreon, the link for which will be in the description of the podcast below. And as always, all funds go back directly into the show. By the way, you can also send me some feedback and let me know how this series is working out for you. Or if you have some good insights, the email is flashpointhistory@gmail.com. You can also follow along with Flashpoint History on Facebook and also on Twitter. So until the next episode, thank you for your time and for listening.